All right, welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are on episode 103. We're continuing to read High Risers by Ben Austen. We're on the top of page 148, almost about halfway through. In 1987, Harold Washington won re-election, halting a Jane Byrne comeback in the Democratic primary. Then he trounced his nemesis, Ed Vrodelack, who had switched parties to run in the general election. Gaining majority control of the city council as well, Washington was positioned finally to push his agenda. But just months into his second term, he slumped over his desk in City Hall. At 65, he was dead of a heart attack. A new mayor, Eugene Sawyer, was selected by his fellow aldermen after a long night of infighting. Hoping to resuscitate the moribund Chicago Housing Authority, Sawyer turned for help to the Metropolitan Planning Council, the influential nonprofit that has shaped city planning in the CHA from its inception. Elizabeth Wood had led the civic group before taking over the Housing Authority. The MPC advised Sawyer to pick a new leader for the CHA, the former Illinois Governor Dick Ogilvy, who promptly accepted the post and then also died of a heart attack. The MPC offered up a second choice, Vince Lane, a 46-year-old African-American developer of low-income housing who'd already been chairing the organization's public housing committee. Lane took over at the CHA in 1988, managing to be named both the executive director and board chairman, positions that were ordinarily separated as a formal check on power. A large, excitable man with a high forehead and trim mustache, Lane has served as an executive of the Woodlawn organization, developing nonprofit housing on the South Side, and he'd also started a successful company building HUD-financed properties across the country. But his conception of public housing had been formed earlier, in the 1950s, when he was growing up in a tenement by the White Sox ballpark. Living across the street from a low-rise public housing development called Wentworth Gardens, Lane envied the working families there. Their homes were new, with neat gardens and large communal lawns. Then Lane watched in awe as the 28 towers of the Robert Taylor homes rose up just east of him. It was an architectural marvel and represented a marked improvement over the slum they replaced. One of Lane's aunts fled a tenement for the Taylor homes, and the entire family celebrated her move as a major step up. Lane was aghast at how far public housing had fallen. A man prone to pronouncements, his high-pitched twang would intensify along with his indignation. Quote, "Horrendous, horrendous," end quote, he screeched about the state of the CHA that was now his responsibility. The mismanaged agency was $30 million in debt, with a bloated staff and a stock of aging housing that hadn't been properly maintained in years. He heard from tenants who were so fearful of stray bullets that they slept in their bathtubs. In his first weeks on the job, gang members firebombed an apartment at Rockwell Gardens, a West Side development, wounding a little girl. At that moment, Lane decided to hell with any real estate or management theories. He couldn't wait for permission from the mayor or a judge. It was his duty, at the very minimum, to establish public order and safety in the housing he oversaw. He borrowed an idea from a Korean War movie he liked called Pork Chop Hill. The GIs in the film, led by Gregory Peck, have to win back the bluff from the Chinese forces, or it's all over for them. As in the movie, Lane wanted to send in troops, overwhelming the enemy in each tower with a massive show of force. Quote, "I saw these high-rise buildings as my pork chop hill, and I had to get control of them," end quote, he'd say. At 5 o'clock a.m. on a Tuesday, CHA personnel and more than 60 police officers met at a staging area along the Dan Ryan Expressway. No one but Lane and the police chief knew about the target of the first raid, as they feared internal leaks would tip off the gangs. The convoy rode west to Rockwell Gardens. Outside the selected high-rise, teams of police blocked the entrances and exits as dozens of other officers rushed inside, searching every apartment for weapons and drugs. CHA staff checked rolls to see who in the building officially belonged and who needed to leave. A second battalion of more than 100 workmen arrived and got to work, reinforcing the lobby with iron grating. They erected guard stations and installed video cameras. A midnight curfew was imposed, and residents were issued identification cards they now needed to display to re-enter their building. Lane called the action Operation Clean Sweep, and announced that he would conduct similar emergency, quote, sweeps, end quote, at each of the city's 168 public housing high-rises and some of the low-rises as well. He would win the war on public housing by going door to door, overtaking one building and then another until the entire system was again safe. When Lane and his troops hit their second targeted high-rise, the surprise factor was already gone. Quote, the lookout saw this huge caravan of trucks and cars, and they realized we were coming to that building, end quote. Lane would recall with a laugh. Quote, drugs and guns rained out of the building, end quote. Within weeks, a parade of vehicles carrying 150 housing officials and police officers made its way to Cabrini Green to lock down one of the high-rises. Lane soon expanded these operations, adding tenant patrols and creating a separate CHA police and security force, its officers training alongside the Chicago police. He placed Chicago police substations inside each of the large housing developments and had them pursue a kind of, quote, broken windows, end quote, strategy, arresting residents for minor offenses as a way to prevent more serious ones. I think what should be pointed out here, well, I guess really it's a couple of different things I'd like to point out here. One of those things is how often these communities that these people were living in were like a police state. How here, one second, I feel like it's a noise. Is it the batteries? One second. Okay, sorry about that. A few technical difficulties. But the thing I just wanted to point out is how often that these communities felt like a police state. How often that the way of trying to deal with some of the crime that was in the area was just simply by force. And one of the things that is important to always remember is that the people who have these guns and drugs in public housing, in poor communities and ghettos, are not the people who are manufacturing the guns, are not the people who are manufacturing the drugs. And so on Monday, you can go and do a clean sweep and get all the guns and all the drugs out of a certain area. But on Tuesday, those guns and drugs will be replaced. And so the thing that is, because, and again, guns and drugs are, and crime and violence are effects and not causes. The causes of these things, as we've read through for over 150 pages now, are poverty, racism, unequitable education, unequitable job opportunities, divestment from these communities. And as long as those issues are not being addressed, then you can do all the sweeps you want for guns and drugs and do all the coming down with heavy force with police officers that you want. These effects will just, again, manifest themselves. And we've seen that multiple people we've seen throughout this, the only consistent attempt of changing anything has been through force and has been through using police officers. That has been the only consistency. There has been no consistent action to try to deal with the causes of these things. Okay. Some CHA tenants and their advocates objected to the siege tactics. Lane never sought warrants to search people's apartments or to seize contraband, and when the American Civil Liberties Union filed a class action lawsuit against the CHA, the agency had to agree to a legally binding consent decree setting limits on the raids, limits that Lane would exceed repeatedly. But other public housing residents welcomed the sweeps. They weighed the trade-off between personal freedom and police protection. They wanted the same level of safety as in every other Chicago community, the same standard of law and order. Lane would visit a development, and women would embrace and kiss him. Men grasped his hand, thanking him for taking on the challenge. Residents submitted requests for the police to raid their buildings, or more commonly, the buildings next to their own. At Cabrini Green, tenants reached out to Alderman Terrace, who then passed along the entreaties. Quote, "You and the police deserve thanks for leadership during the Cabrini Green public safety crisis now taking place," end quote, he wrote to Lane. He asked that the agency put a stop to the crossfire between high-rises, adding, quote, "You have my full support." I think what I want to speak about in that passage that we just read is the fact that you shouldn't have to pick between your freedom and your safety. And they talk about how they wanted the same type of safety that was in these other neighborhoods. And the truth of the matter is the people in those other neighborhoods did not have to choose between freedom or safety. They did not have to allow them and their neighbors to have their civil rights violated by people entering their homes without proper warrants. Because the people in those other neighborhoods were white, because the people in those other neighborhoods had generationally better circumstances for them growing up, which led to them having better living situations. There was never an option of choosing between their freedom and their safety. And that's one of the things that's important to point out when there are people who, of course, there's going to, as long as there are people who live in a community where crime is happening and bullets are flying and people's houses are being broken into, you're going to want safety. You're going to become desperate to have safety. But the truth of the matter is that the police department and these laws are not the things that are going to give you safety. They may be able to prolong something. They may be able to remove a certain individual. But as long as the causes of these things continue to manifest or continue to be there, the safety will never be something that is consistent. For many outside public housing as well, Lane's tactics seemed the appropriate response to the perceived mayhem of the inner city. The sweeps coincided with the hysteria over crack cocaine and with gangs battling one another over the growing market. The crack epidemic was real. By 1991, 70% of males arrested in Chicago tested positive for cocaine. Yet the crisis didn't elicit calls to mobilize medical and social services, and addicts weren't treated with sympathy. Rather, they were crack fiends, a scourge, and when they weren't being ignored in their ghettos, they were to be arrested, incarcerated, and eradicated. It was time for civil society to take its stand and reclaim its streets. The teenage homicide rate rose steadily from the mid-'80s and into the start of the '90s, a tragic effect of the booming drug trade, the poor economy, and the growing strength of organized gangs. The number of killings in Chicago climbed each year, nearing numbers not seen in the city in 2 decades. But there was also much fretting over illusory threats. Images proliferated of premature, quote, crack babies, end quote, infants exposed to the drug in utero and now convulsing in their cribs. The media reported constantly on this coming tide of damaged children spreading out from the country's black slums, a permanent underclass that would deplete the store of social services and grow up to run amok. In 1989, in New York City, a 28-year-old white investment banker was out on her nightly jog in Central Park when she was raped and beaten nearly to death. Police investigating the, quote, Central Park jogger, end quote, case arrested several 14, 15, and 16-year-olds who lived in Harlem. According to their confessions, they admitted to being out, quote, wilding, end quote. The 5 teens never uttered the term. It was a police construct made up during a night of bullying, interrogations, and deceptions, and the convictions would be vacated more than a decade later. But the term made sense to people, at least emotionally. It evoked a prevailing idea of out-of-control juvenile violence, the offenders like wolves in a pack, quote, savage, end quote, feral, end quote, and, quote, pre-social, end quote. Quote, how can our great society tolerate the continued brutalization of its citizens by crazed misfits, end quote. Donald Trump wrote in a full-page ad he paid for in the New York Daily News before the boys' trial. Quote, civil liberties end when an attack on our safety begins, end quote. John DeLulio, a political scientist at Princeton, coined the term, quote, super predator, end quote, to characterize this imagined growing population of murderous boys, mostly black, who were, he said, quote, fatherless, godless, and jobless, end quote. He cited a prosecutor who told him, quote, they kill or maim on impulse without any intelligible motive, end quote. And that passage brings us to something that we read in Have Black Lives Ever Mattered by Mumia Abu-Jamal, where he spoke about the Central Park 5 that also in the Central Park Five being arrested and then eventually being having their convictions overturned after another person confessed to the crime. That also brings us to something that Angela Y. Davis spoke about in Women, Race, and Class in the chapter where she spoke about the black rapist, the myth of the black rapist, and how that fear of the black rapist is what led to so many lynchings, and what also that in the other side of that coin of the fear of the black rapist is the lack of hearing the black women who were raped primarily by white men. And I guess the main thing that I would want to point out from there is the importance of being able to cross-reference these different pieces of literature that we're reading, the importance of being able to read something and to comprehend it and to store it for later use, and to be able to articulate all of the different facets of the society that that breeds these circumstances that exist in these primarily black and brown communities, in these poor communities, in these working class communities. The term super predators, I think that's something that when we were reading in Race Matters by Cornel West, he spoke about the Clinton administration and how they Hillary and Bill Clinton were using this word super predator almost in conjunction with black people, and the connotation that this term super predator had, and how laws began to be made specifically because of the crack epidemic, and how the crack epidemic was not looked at as a health crisis or a medical crisis, how addiction in this society, in this country, specifically when it is an addiction that black people are dealing with, that poor people are dealing with, is not looked at as a health crisis or a medical crisis. And because it's not looked at it that way, it's looked at as this criminal element that needs to be removed. People who need help are not given that help. Instead, they're given punishment. And I think that again is something that is important to point out, that so the systems that we have in place in this country do more to create people who will be victimizers than it does to help people who are victims, that it does more to hurt people who need help than it does to help people that have been hurt. In Chicago, the super predators were coming for you from Cabrini Green, obviously. Quote, "What is the place that quickly strikes fear in the hearts of the citizens of Chicago?" End quote. Asked the 1988 profile of a police officer who dared to work the Cabrini Green beat. Quote, "The Green has become synonymous with the jungle, a place where wild animals roam and devour weaker organisms." End quote. A national television news program on Cabrini Green asked viewers to visualize a barbarous war zone. Quote, "A no man's land with broken windows, dark, abandoned buildings, no law and order. There are carefully demarcated areas controlled by rival bands of armed militia fighting over the rubble. Nearly every night there is sniper fire. It sounds like Beirut, but in fact it's America. A creature of state, local, and federal government. A product of bad politics, failed policy, and official neglect." End quote. That the larger societal fears weren't based on sound science hardly mattered at the time. Children displayed no serious lasting effects from their prenatal exposure to crack. Most babies born prematurely jittered in this way, and mothers who abused alcohol during pregnancy did as much harm and were far more common. Moreover, Delillou's predictions that horrendous crimes committed by inner-city teens would double and triple in the coming years proved grossly inaccurate. Violent crimes peaked in 1991 and then dropped precipitously. By the late 90s, juvenile crime rates had fallen back to the levels of the early 1980s as the economy improved and crack use abated. By then, however, the hysteria had cemented into policy. Nearly every state had passed harsher sentencing laws for juvenile offenders. Children were being tried as adults and receiving mandatory minimum sentences, including life terms. Pregnant cocaine users were charged with child abuse and even manslaughter. In Chicago, annual arrests for drugs other than marijuana tripled in less than a decade, with African Americans making up most of those charged. It was during this panic that Vince Lane was touted as a hero. Republicans in Washington praised his aggressive approach, which was seen as a model for other cities to follow. Lane was compared to Joe Louis Clark, the bat-swinging principal of a New Jersey high school who was played by Morgan Freeman in Lean On Me, the movie based on his life. Clark had summarily dismissed hundreds of students who were, he said, quote, leeches, miscreants, and hoodlums, end quote. The country needed vigilantes like that who were willing to bend the rules, and Lane was tackling social problems that others thought too intractable and hopeless even to bother with, in the process giving CHA employees a new sense of purpose. Workers under him wore buttons announcing, quote, I'm part of the solution, end quote. He said the gangs who operated in public housing were like playground bullies, and the suites were his way to, quote, throw the bullies out, end quote. In 1990, Lane was featured on the cover of the Chicago Tribune Sunday magazine, standing on the roof of a Cabrini Green high-rise, other towers of tartan, red brick rising up around him like battlements. Wearing a dark suit, his arms folded across his chest, Lane was a man reigning over his domicile. But the sweeps were problematic from the start. In addition to being ruled unconstitutional, they were prohibitively expensive. The estimated cost of a single sweep of a single high-rise was $175,000, and that was without the amount paid in overtime to Chicago police officers. Quote, it cost a shitload, end quote, Lane acknowledged. He was able to secure additional funds from Washington. The CHA also used money on the anti-crime initiative that could have gone to major repairs. The building suffered further decline. And whenever Lane swept a high-rise, crime increased in the surrounding buildings. He wasn't so much removing guns and drugs and miscreants as shifting them around. With each raid, fewer weapons and drugs were confiscated as people anticipated the invading force. J.R. Fleming said news of the approaching CHA army would reach a building at Cabrini Green, and those with contraband would gather up their goods and store them outside in the trunks of cars. Lane also knew enough about the world of public housing to understand that there was something counterproductive in removing every male who wasn't on a lease. Officially, women headed 9 of 10 households in CHA properties. Men were around, though. They were people's sons and lovers and fathers. Quote, I was conflicted, end quote, Lane would admit. Who was he to say if the guys were drug dealers or good fathers or both? Quote, to tear somebody out of this family environment was, I thought, wrong, end quote, Lane said. Quote, it wasn't the right thing to do, the right signal to send. We wanted to send the signal that if you share a relationship with someone and have kids, we will work with you, help you get an education and all that. But I continued to move ahead and secure building after building. I really thought we could secure most of the city. Who would have thought that you could secure Robert Taylor and Cabrini Green? Did I succeed? End quote. He'd answer the question himself, his voice breaking into a higher register. Quote, absolutely, absolutely, end quote. And then that brings us to a changing of the theme quickly here. But I think what I want to point out is how $175,000 was spent to go through a single high rise, and that didn't take into account how much money would be used on overtime for police officers. And that is and they even said that money, the money he was spending, was not getting spent on renovating and on the upkeep of these public housings. And so they were spending more money trying to imprison people and catch people breaking the law inside of these public housing, inside of these substandard living conditions. And they were spending trying to change the conditions that these people were living in. Then they were spending on trying to put programs and give assistance to these families. And when you think about that $175,000 going into a building, what could they have done? And the reason that they did this is because they would get guns out the building, they would get drugs out the building, and those guns and drugs, because of laws that have eventually would be passed and things like that, that money would get cycled back into the system of whether law enforcement or the system of the city government, the convictions, the arrests that they would make, fines and court costs, court fees. All of these things were a way for them to make money, whether that's something that is being overtly stated or not. That when somebody is arrested, the city makes money off of that. If the person gets bailed out, they make money. The city, the county makes money off of that bail. If that person has to pay court fines once they're arrested, they make money off of that. Jails get money off of how many cells are occupied. And so that's the other part that you have to pay attention to, is that not only were they not putting that $175,000 into trying to change the conditions these people were living in, they were also making money off of these arrests and these things that they were doing. J.R. Fleming. Because he was straight out of the suburbs, J.R. did run into some trouble at Cabrini Green. Sporting his all-red football Letterman jacket with the collar popped up like Fonzie from Happy Days, he didn't realize that his colors represented the Vice Lords and Cobra Stones. One time, a disciple near Jenner's school demanded of him, quote, "What do you ride?" end quote. J.R. took the question literally, not even trying to be funny. Quote, "The bus?" end quote. He was at first perplexed that because he now stayed in a building controlled by the gangster disciples, he couldn't cross the blacktop and visit the building where he lived as a child that was now home to Cobra Stones. After the mostly white community of Dalton, he expected Cabrini Green to be an all-black world free of tensions and bigotry. Quote, "What is this?" end quote, he asked. Quote, "Black people don't like black people?" end quote. When he attended Lincoln Park High School in the fall, everyone assumed he was in the Disciples because his cousins and the next-door neighbors were in the gang. He would tell people that he wasn't folks. Quote, "I'm a nerd. I'm an athlete. I'm competitive," end quote. It didn't matter. A group of Vice Lords chased him out of the pool. J.R. racing home in his swim trunks. Back on the land at Cabrini, people teased him. Quote, "You're not in Kansas anymore," end quote. Quote, "Then tell me where I'm at and what I need to do to survive," end quote, J.R. would demand. He was walking one day, pushing a bicycle, when a couple of guys on Larrabee started telling him they were going to rob him. Quote, "Can I see your bike? I just want to ride, man," end quote. The bike belonged to his cousin G-Ball from 1117 North Cleveland, the Castle. No way was J.R. giving it up. He decided he needed to defend himself. This wasn't dunking a basketball or rushing for a first down. A family member lent him a .32 automatic. The following day, he was heading up Larrabee with a girl named Trisha, and he told her about his predicament. Quote, "I got this right here for them," end quote, he said, showing her the pistol in his pocket. The weapon didn't surprise her. Quote, "Shoot them in the leg," end quote, she suggested as moderation. But when they came upon the guys, Trisha turned out to be related to them. Quote, "You're not shooting my cousins," end quote, she said, shouting. Quote, "He's got a gun," end quote. Quote, "You really got a gun for us?" end quote, laughed the bigger of the two, a guy people at Cabrini called Frank Nitti, after Al Capone's enforcer. He seemed amused, as if J.R. hadn't been in on the joke. Quote, "We was just fucking with you, man," end quote. He and J.R. would later become friends. J.R. was inclined to see the world through the lens of sports, so he tried to approach Cabrini Green as if it were a football game, discerning the rules amid the disorder. Quote, "You just need to follow your blockers. Follow your blockers and you'll survive," end quote, he told himself. He went to G-Ball and read through the Disciples' literature. One of the gang's first tenets was that the GDs aided and assisted their own members. But J.R. looked around and saw that the gang was making a lot of his drug money in the Whites, the towers across Division Street. His red high-rise on Larrabee was on the front lines, directly across from a 19-story Vice Lord's tower. It didn't seem like anyone was too interested in aiding and assisting them. J.R. phoned his father. Willie Sr. told J.R. to stay out of the gangs. He said J.R.'s brain worked differently than the brains of other guys in the projects, that he was too smart to get involved in petty battles. The advice played to J.R.'s ego. Quote, "Don't be a pawn in another man's game of chess," end quote, his father counseled. Instead of game banging, J.R. formed a clique in his building called Ski Love, which was mostly about throwing parties, selling a little weed, and hooking up with girls. Their motto, quote, "Bang, bang, bang, ski, ski, ski," end quote. After being run out of Lincoln Park, J.R. tried another area high school, Wells, a mile and a half west. But he didn't see school in their shoes. But he didn't see any learning happening there, Students brought guns and knives to school in their shoes. The Puerto Ricans fought the blacks who fought other blacks. One day, a posse of Spanish Cobras was waiting for him outside the school. J.R. knew he couldn't fight the entire neighborhood. He elected instead to punch the assistant principal. He would be expelled. But he reasoned correctly that the police would come and drive him home, past the waiting gangbangers. It tore up his mother, but J.R. was done with school forever. And then that's the end of chapter 8. And as we have been reading, and a reminder just that, people are products of their environment. And when JR moved into a different environment, it changed him. And I think the thing that's probably the thing that stands out to me the most is that he got expelled out of school the second time for trying to survive. He didn't feel that he could walk home past the Spanish Cobras, and he felt that the safest way for him to get home was to get a ride from the police, to get escorted by the police back home. And that led to him being expelled. And then even him getting the first time he got a gun, just like we read about Kelvin, when Kelvin, I believe it was Kelvin, one of the people that we read about, the first time that they got a gun when they was younger was because they were worried about violence happening to them, because they were trying to make sure that they were okay. And again, this so many people who have been arrested for guns or have been convicted for for possessing a firearm have those guns for protection, have those guns for survival. And when you aren't living in circumstances where survival is at the top of the to-do list every day, it's hard to put yourself in that type of a mind state. All right, so I'm going to end this episode here. We'll start the next chapter on the next episode. I want to thank everybody for taking the time to listen. And I want to encourage people to go back and listen to previous episodes of Rockford Reading Daily. And if by the time you listen to this, there's future episodes out, please go and listen to those future episodes of Rockford Reading Daily. And this is just a reminder that we put these episodes out every day to present people the opportunity to begin and to further their journey in the struggle to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. All right, we'll talk tomorrow.